Friends, longtime Galveston residents and friends of our community, Jackie Cole and Harvey Rice today. Jackie, is a popular veterinarian, a city council representative, and founder of the Galveston Tree Conservancy. Harvey was a journalist with the Houston Chronicle for many years and has been a journalist for 45 years. Jackie studied Bön, the native religion of Tibet, for over 20 years and has extensive connections within the Bön community worldwide. Jackie and Harvey have traveled to New York, Tibet, India, Nepal, France, Italy, the UK, and Estonia for interviews and research for this book. So they'll be speaking to us today about their book, Tibetan Journey, Stories from the Ambush at Muro Ri. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jackie Cole and Harvey Rice.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hi, good morning. We've had such an adventure. And the question is, how did we come to write a book about Tibet?
You just have to kind of speak right.
How's that? All right. Well, we've been on, as you can imagine from her description, a great adventure. And how did this even start? How did we come to write a book about Tibet? Well, as Kathleen said, I have been a student and a practitioner of Bön, and you may not have ever heard of Bön, but it's one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. It was actually the original religion in Tibet. And it was practiced even in Tibet before Buddhism came to Tibet in the 7th century. It was persecuted during that time until about 1100s when it was revitalized. Many scholars and most Buddhists say that Bön, the Yungdrung Bön that I study, came from Buddhism. Most Bonpos say that Buddha Sakyamuni was just a reincarnation of Bön's original Buddha, Trungpa Shenrab. So who borrowed from who is the age-old question. They look very similar pantheons, stories, mythology, iconography. If you walked into a room full of the art, unless you were schooled, you probably couldn't tell the difference between one and the other. We do not believe that there is a universal God. The Buddha is a teacher that provides the information for the path that you can take, the curriculum. It's actually a curriculum that you can study to train your mind to realize the enlightenment that is there within you already. You are a Buddha. We're all Buddhas. There are as many Buddhas as there are stars in the sky. The Bön tradition, because of its indigenous origins in Tibet, and because of the way Tibet is so harsh, it carries more connections to the natural elements and their effects and capabilities for healing on beings and on the earth. So for the most part, the basic understanding of Bön is the same as Tibetan Buddhism. It's essentially a religion based on compassion and wisdom. As the Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness. I would attend teachings, and the lamas, or teachers, and geshes, which is the equivalent of a PhD in theology, would first present their credentials. They would tell you where they came from, who their teachers were, where the text was coming from in the lineage of the text. over time, after hearing this, I began to hear that there were only 4 masters who had escaped that were from Tibet in the 50s and were still alive. And I knew that time, that 10 years ago, they were in their 80s, and I knew that if their stories were not told, it'd be lost with their passing. Not that the Tibetans wouldn't have written down their stories, but it would have been lost to the greater community. So
how's that? All right. So the decision to write this book came one day about 10 years ago as I was sitting in my office working on a story for the Houston Chronicle. Jackie came in and began telling me about one of her teachers who was shot and left for dead as he was attempting to escape Chinese-occupied Tibet. We didn't know the entire story at that time, but the details that she gave me were so compelling that I was immediately on board when she suggested that we write a book. We made 2 trips to India, 2 to Nepal, and an unforgettable trip to Tibet to witness the Chinese oppression that began after the invasion in 1950 and continues to this day. We flew over the Himalayas, getting a nice view of the top of Mount Everest, and landed at the Lhasa airport, about a 30-minute drive from the city. We were required to have a government-approved guide, but the guide was late to arrive at the airport, and the Chinese officials would not let us through the customs and officially into Tibet without our guide. That was our first brush with Chinese restrictions. And the guide was to keep an eye on us. One of the first things we noticed was the heavy Chinese military presence in Lhasa. Military bases were scattered throughout the city, the gate of each guarded by a soldier at port arms sheltered in a glass guardhouse. In downtown Lhasa, the police had a kiosk about every 100 yards. We had to go through a metal detector to enter the Barkor, the downtown square surrounding the Jokang, Tibet's oldest Buddhist temple. Matches and lighters were banned because of Buddhists setting themselves alight in front of the Jokang to protest the Chinese occupation. We also encountered police roadblocks every 50 to 100 miles manned by police with automatic weapons. We had to show our passport at each roadblock before receiving a time-stamped certificate. We had to present the certificate at the next roadblock so they would know how long it took us to get there. If we arrived too early, we got a ticket for speeding. That's why there were long lines of trucks waiting near the roadblocks. Their drivers sitting in cafes, drinking tea, waiting for the clock to run on their time-stamped certificates. The Chinese kept a tight rein on monasteries. We visited a small Buddhist monastery outside Lhasa. On the wall surrounding the garden was an organization table with photos of the monastery officials. At the top of the hierarchy was not a monk or the abbot, but a member of the Chinese Communist Party. The abbot and other monastery officials were below him in rank. When we visited the Muro Monastery in Tibet, once the premier Bön monastery, we were told by one of our guides to avoid interviewing monks. First, because we would not have been allowed to enter the country had the Chinese officials known we were researching a book. Second, because every monk we spoke with would be interrogated by Chinese officials to find out what we had said. And third, because every monastery had spies that would report everything we did to the authorities. There was no road to Muro, until the Chinese built one so they could dispatch police there quickly. When we were there, a police station was being built just below the monastery. And I'll turn it back over to Jackie.
In our book, not only is there a whole host of supporting characters that help to that are interesting in and of themselves and help to explain the situation, we have three main characters. We tell their stories from childhood until now, trying to weave in the amazing geography, lifestyles, mores, and culture of an isolated country that's isolated due to choices it's made, but also to its vastness. In fact, I consider Tibet the very definition of vast. Judy, can you put up the map? Oh, the other one? Do you have the other one? Okay. In our book, we have two maps that we had made that show the escape routes of our characters. This is the escape route of Tenzin Namdok when he was shot. And it's a smaller portion of Tibet. And you can see on this one that this is from the middle of Tibet, and it comes down across the Himalayas and into Nepal. If you can go from that, Judy, to the picture that's a landscape, that'll give everybody a good idea. And this is actually a good segue into that, if you can open that one, if that's possible. No? Okay. All right. If you find the other map, put it up. Otherwise, we'll just keep going. You all know where Tibet is. It sits above India, between China on its east and India and okay, here we are. Yes. So the Himalayas are this gigantic, all the way across there, that separates Tibet from Nepal and India. Samten Karme and Sanjay Tenzin, two of our characters, came from neighboring villages in Amdo, there in eastern Tibet, and went to school together. They became and remained lifelong friends, despite different paths after the escape. Tenzin Namdok, our other third character, was born in 1926 in Kham, the southern part there on the far eastern part. Destined to be monks in their youth, the invasion by the Chinese and subsequent crackdown on religious institutions changed their lives completely. Tenzin Namdok was shot and left for dead during his escape attempt, only to be saved by friends and strangers along the way. Samten Karme and Sanjay Tenzin were able to walk out to Nepal. They had been in Lhasa at the time of the bombing, and they were able to escape from there and walk out to Nepal uneventfully, if you consider 2 months of walking uneventful, only to be hit with dysentery due to climate and crowded conditions in refugee camps. They fortuitously, in various assorted ways, ran into a British scholar who invited them to London, all three of them, joining the three most learned of the Bön community in exile together and starting them on a journey that would inexorably change their lives and the lives of the Bonpos in exile. Every time we turned around or talked to someone else, there was another fascinating little tidbit to add to the drama that was already there. The description of a pilgrimage around Mount Kailash, the center of the universe. Murderous monks who took over a monastery where Tenzin Namdok was painting. The isolation of Tibetans from the rest of the world by choice, leaving them vulnerable to the Chinese. the abject poverty of the lower classes in Lhasa, unheard of in the more rural areas of Tibet where our characters had come from. The CIA, the United States' CIA connections to the Khampa rebels, training of hand-picked Tibetans in Colorado, dropping them back into Tibet and doing arms drops to try to support them. A disaster for the Tibetans, but that's another story. The fight for Lhasa with the shelling and destruction of the monasteries and killings of the monks and civilians. The mother monastery Minri, the escape of the Tibetans, of the monks that were there, once they realized that they had no out for them to escape, only to be ambushed twice before reaching the Chongtong, or these are all words you don't know yet, but you will. Tenzin Namdok was in the center of Tibet. Remember I showed you this map here? He was up on the Chongtong, 15,000 feet normal elevation across there, very desolate looking at another monastery, and they were going up there to try to meet with him. 9 of the 30 survived the journey, joined up with him, and then as they were leaving, they were ambushed again, which is at Muro Ri. The mountain was named Muro Ri. That's where the Chinese found them again and ambushed them, and so that's when Tenzin was shot. Tenzin Namdok's remarkable survival after being shot and left to die, his stay in a concentration camp and subsequent hike over the Himalayas in winter to Nepal and to freedom, but little else. Their trip to London, sponsored by the imperious Englishman David Snellgrove, who soon lost control of his charges while they were there. 2 of them sneaked off to see the Pope. Actually, on monk time, typical monk time, arriving one day late for their appointment. This is an escape book. It's a survival book. It's very exciting. But it's also a book about devotion. Devotion of the people to their faith, to each other, to their country, and to their culture. And Harvey would like to read you a section of it. Do you want to come here so you put your papers down? You all right?
So I'm going to read the prologue, which kind of gives a hint of what's to come. All right, I'm reading the prologue, which gives us it's sort of a preview of the book. Fear hastened Tenzin Namdok to the top of a rocky ridge, one of the many that crisscross Tibet's highest plateau. A frigid breeze whipped his face as he scanned the treeless, rocky landscape, searching for a glimpse of the Chinese troops who hunted him and his companions. He knew the soldiers would shoot them on sight. The year was 1960. The Chinese had invaded Tibet a decade earlier and cajoled it into surrender with promises of respect for its religion and culture. Forsaken by the rest of the world and its military severely outmatched, Tibet had grudgingly agreed to allow China to station troops in its capital, Lhasa. But Chinese communism was incompatible with the deeply religious Tibetan culture. Popular resentment swelled, finally exploding in a violent uprising. In retaliation, the Chinese began a vicious campaign of religious persecution. Tenzin, 34, one of the most revered lamas of the Bön religion, Tibet's oldest and least known faith, was among thousands of Tibetans fleeing the country to avoid re-education sessions where they were forced to accuse, beat, and even execute neighbors and family in a Chinese campaign targeting religion. Chinese troops were dispatched to seal the borders and hunt Tibetans fleeing to Nepal, India, and Bhutan. Tenzin hoped to outpace his pursuers, and he headed west across Tibet's bleakest and least populated terrain. Strung out along the trail with Tenzin were 30 companions, among them the most learned Bön lamas. Others were monks who had renounced their vows of nonviolence to protect the lamas. The lamas and their escorts had traveled hundreds of miles from several different monasteries to Tenzin's small, remote monastery on the Changtong Plateau, a vast and desolate landscape of high plains and mountains, thinly populated by nomadic herders. In a time of crisis, they looked to Tenzin for direction because of his eminent reputation. They would have lost that leadership had he taken an offer of safe passage from a wealthy merchant making his way to the border, who brought stories of Chinese cruelty and news that the Dalai Lama had fled the country. The merchant had urged Tenzin to leave with him, but Tenzin would not forsake his fellow monks. Disregarding his own safety, he had resolved to await word from the lamas who were dodging Chinese patrols as they made their way to him. Tenzin and the lamas had set out 3 days earlier, joined by dozens of lay Tibetans and a group of armed rebels. Tenzin divided the refugees into 3 groups. Each group would travel within sight of the other, allowing the others to flee if one were attacked. Heading west, they changed direction whenever they spotted the black yak-haired tents of nomads or their flocks of sheep. They knew betrayal could be inspired by fear or bought with Chinese silver. The monks carried the few sacred texts and artifacts they had been able to rescue from their monasteries before they were looted by Chinese troops. Tenzin carried the most sacred object, a 600-year-old reliquary containing the ashes of the founder of Bon's premier monastery. The artifacts were mere slivers of a culture under assault by the Chinese. Soldiers were torturing and killing monks while razing religious buildings, destroying texts, statues, and paintings. Tenzin's world was being ripped away. Escape was the only way to ensure the monks' survival as well as the survival of Bön. Protection lay in crossing the daunting Himalayas south of the vast plateau. In Sanskrit, Himalaya means abode of the snow. The Himalayas would be the final abode for untold numbers of Tibetans as they died from hunger, cold, avalanches, and steep plunges from rocky heights during their trek to freedom. Moving as fast as possible, members of Tenzin's party continually cast wary eyes behind them. As the cold blue sky faded toward darkness, the monks made camp in the shadow of a mountain at the edge of a lake, tethering their pack animals and pitching their tents. While the animals were being unloaded, a black donkey reared and snorted, refusing to be handled. Tenzin saw it as a dark portent. As the monks crouched around the campfire, heating water for black tea, the crack of a single bullet rent the air. The men bolted upright in alarm. The shot grew to a fusillade as the Tibetans scattered. Streams of green tracer bullets licked at scurrying figures, pitching them onto the earth. Tenzin ran for his life. The Chinese had found them.
We are happy to take any questions that you might have about our book. Marty. Why did they want it? Well, what they said was that they were liberating Tibet from outside forces and the Tibetans from poverty. What they wanted was the natural resources. They have a huge amount of minerals. They have the water of all of Asia. and huge amounts of natural resources, including a lot of the stuff that's being used now for alternative energy.
It,
Yeah.
and I might add to that China had long claimed Tibet. So even Chiang Kai-shek, when he was head of the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, they asserted a claim to Tibet, and they actually had some soldiers coming on the fringes of Amdo. They had a garrison there, and which was pretty much scorned and just ignored by the Tibetans. But nevertheless, it was important to the Chinese, and it was so important that when the Chinese communists invaded Tibet, Chiang Kai-shek, who was on Taiwan, would refuse to renounce or give up the Chinese claim to Tibet that he had asserted. And that's one reason that the United States wouldn't come to Tibet's aid more forcefully. There were other reasons, but that's one of them. So.
Yes.
When y'all were in Tibet to visit the elevation, I understand much of Tibet is a very high altitude. Did y'all have trouble breathing there?
Yes. He was asking about the elevation in Tibet and if we had any trouble there, and I have to say yes. We both took altitude sickness medicine before we went, but Lhasa itself is 12,500. And so you go from Kathmandu, which is 5,000, to 12,500 in a flight. And I got altitude sickness very badly. They called the hotel where we were staying in Lhasa has a thing of your phone that says, call us if you have trouble. And so they have a doctor on staff. They sent a doctor to my room, and he wrote out, well, you can have the deluxe service for this, or you can have the regular service for this. I said, give me the deluxe. And so, but I recovered quite quickly from the severe symptoms that I was having, but it took us a good number of days to be able to really function very well at all. He didn't have as much trouble as I did. So, but it is a serious issue. Kathleen.
So is your book out?
It's not out yet. We have procured an agent, we're happy to say, who's very excited about it. She's from California and is a Buddhist herself and likes the story, wants to promote the story because of not because it took us, 52? She was our 52nd letter of inquiry. So much like Harry Potter we're not going to be like Harry Potter, but much like Harry Potter got rejected 66 times, we were rejected 52, plus a few publishers who rejected us. The problem is that it's a very small niche book. And so publishing nowadays, unless you self-publish, publishing nowadays with the publishers, they want to know how much money you're going to make them by how many books you're going to sell. And small niche books aren't going to sell very much. So we were hoping to be able to find a wider audience for this than just the bumpos. But anyway, it's ready to go, and our agent has told us that she's going to start shopping it next week. So we're very excited. So it'll be out next year. That's what she said. I mean, we've got to have a publisher first, but based on the industry, it'll be ready next year. It is finished, which may move the time frame up a little bit. We don't have to write it as we go, which a lot of books are written as you go along through the process. Anything else? Okay, yes.
How do you plan on dealing with the censoring that you will encounter once it is published by other authoritarian governments?
The what we'll encounter?
Censorship.
Well, they censor. There's not anything we're going to be able to do with that. I mean, we've already decided we're not going back to Tibet. I mean,
If this book is published, we will never be allowed to travel to China again.
and you know, the names of people, some names of people that have helped us along the way are definitively never spoken. Their name is never spoken because they do want to go back to Tibet. And we've had a good number of people who we've asked for forwards who have said no, they can't do it because they want to maintain their relationship to be able to go back to Tibet, to the monasteries there and so forth. So it was a choice we made in order to tell the story. Anything else? Thank you all so much for your attention.